The Rubicon, starring Jeremy Winston, in 3, 2, 1.
All right, you're on again with Jeremy Winston, again, a new show on the Advent Sports Network. This is the Rubicon. I have Dr. Joel Boyce, who is the Assistant Principal of Instruction at Columbia Middle School in DeKalb County in Georgia. Happy to have him on, and we are going to be talking today very briefly about Common Core. And just to let you know, Common Core is a very hotbed issue in politics now. Obviously, as the race for the presidency gears up, we find people running to each corner. If you're a Republican, you run to one corner on the issue. If you're Democrat, you run to the other corner on the issue. No matter what the issue is, it seems like politics are picking sides, and Common Core is absolutely one of them. Ted Cruz really is running on a platform to break down Common Core. And if you don't have a child in school right now, this may be something foreign to you. But Joel and I are contemporaries, went to high school and college together, roomed together for a period there, and we are both parents of young kids and sending them through grade school right now. Common Core is a very real issue. So I want to just talk to Joel, since Joel has a very direct connection with Common Core, and first get an explanation for him. So if you're not familiar with what Common Core is, Joel's going to take a second and describe to us what Common Core is and the purpose of it, and then we're going to talk a little further. So Joel, thanks for being on the call.
Appreciate it. I'm glad to be here.
So tell us about Common Core.
Well, the Common Core is a set of academic expectations that were introduced a few years ago. It was actually an initiative by the governors of states across the country. And what they were trying to do was a few things, but one of the major ones was they were trying to standardize expectations for what students should be able to do at the end of a grade level. Also, on a larger scale, as you know, we talk a lot about global competitiveness and how prepared our students are to enter the workforce and to be able to be competitive with students from Finland and Sweden and China and Japan. And the goal of the Common Core on the national level was to make sure that we raised the bar for what students were able to do when they enter the workforce, and that we had a higher measuring stick for competency. And so you see that many states had to actually change their standards, because when they looked at them in terms of what I might be required to do to show proficiency in a state in the South like Georgia, was not aligned to what a student in Michigan or Connecticut or New York or California, whose standards were considered to be much higher, had to do. And so all across the country, you saw the Departments of Education led by the governors were trying to raise that level of expectation for their students in their states.
So in your relationship to this, and of course, and again, Joel Boyce, Dr. Boyce is the Assistant Principal of Instruction. So were you following this as the governors of these states were developing these standards and so forth? Was this something that you were aware of, or did it just kind of come down the pipe one year and say, oh, this is what we're going to be doing?
Well, that's a good question. Actually, we were well aware that this initiative was coming. We didn't know what it was going to look like, but we were told as this was beginning to be developed that it was going to be far different from what we had. In Georgia, we had moved to the Georgia Performance Standards, which was our level of standards, but we had already been told in the implementation and design process far before it even got to our state that what we were doing was not on par with other states, like I mentioned, Connecticut, Texas, California, Michigan, New York. And so we knew changes were coming. We actually saw the standards and we compared them to what we currently did. It was an understatement that what we had been doing was far below, in terms of rigor, what other states were requiring for students to show mastery of concepts at the end of a grade level. So The change for our students, especially in the South, was pretty drastic.
Right. Well, I hope that explains it for our listeners what Common Core is and the purpose of it. And just like anything politically, and just for those tuning in, this is the Rubicon on the Advent Sports Network. I'm Jeremy Winston, your host. We have Dr. Joel Boyce on talking about Common Core issues. And let's talk about the political implications. My approach to politics, I really like to, as best as I can, approach any issue with as much objectivity that I possibly can bring. And most of the times when we really look at an issue, there's rarely one side that's completely right and one side that's completely wrong. When I look at Common Core, I understand the need of America to really make sure that we're educating our students at a level that will make sure that they're going to be able to compete professionally with students from other countries. And we know that there are many other countries that are really driving their grade level and high school level students hard, and we just don't want to fall behind. So I understand that, but then there is another side to it, and I think the Republicans have really captured this other perspective. One, obviously, is this idea of the expanding the power and the role of government beyond what it's supposed to do. And I know Huckabee and like I said, Cruz have pushed that, and they feel like this is another government takeover, so to speak, that the government is now telling you what you need to teach in the schools. I don't want to necessarily talk about that specifically, but I want to talk about more the anecdotal experiences that a lot of my friends, and as a parent of a 3-year-old and who's not 3-year-old, of one in 3rd grade and one that's in kindergarten, they bring home some interesting questions that are, quite frankly, the results of Common Core. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that if you're listening to this on YouTube, I'm going to ask our producer James Lewis to go and put this picture up, but there's a picture of a math problem from Common Core, and it's a simple math problem. It says 37 plus 40. And obviously we know that answer would be 77. But what it does is it says instead of just doing the 37 on top of the 40 and put the plus sign and add it, 7 plus 0 and 4 plus 3, it's saying 30 plus 10 plus 10 plus 10. And I think I have one more plus 10, and you had to add 10 each time. And so you have 4 sets of 10s, and those 4 sets of 10 obviously represents 40, but it creates a number of steps to get an answer that can be gotten at a much quicker method. And so I think a lot of the concerns that I've heard parents and a lot of my friends and people posted pictures of these questions is that it's teaching some concepts that are much more basic in a much more complicated way, which is making it more difficult. And I know a lot of people have objections to that, and even politicians have talked about that. How do we as or even should we? I mean, is this something obviously I want my listeners to come to their own conclusions, but how do we approach and, I guess, synthesize all this information to say that maybe this is something that's beneficial for our children, or should we be concerned about the complexities that they're being taught at such an early age?
Well, 2 things. One, I just want to go back to one thing you said earlier. The Common Core initially was led, of course, by the states and some of the superintendents of education, but currently there's only 42 states that actually are actively using Common Core. It's become a lightning rod for, as you said, political pundits and for people running for office, because it was led under a Democratic presidential administration. But some of the states that have actually pulled out of Common Core have Republican governors. States who never adopted them, like Virginia. Some states said our standards were already rigorous enough, we don't need Common Core. I believe Indiana does not have it. Texas never had it. Some other states have pulled out of Common Core. And so it is a educational football, hot football that gets tossed around a lot. And you mentioned about some of the convoluted processes in math. And math is probably the most glaring debatable issue about Common Core and do we need Common Core, because it is focused on the steps by which students arrive at an answer much more than it is the answer that they arrive at. It's much more focused on how you think through that process. And it's probably a little bit clearer if you look at a subject like language arts. I'm a former language arts teacher, and we focus a lot on not just getting the right answer, but Common Core focuses on how can you prove what you know, your textual evidence, which is a big word that we hear a lot about, argument and evidence. How can you prove it? Where can you go back into the text to be able to show this one? How do you know, how does the author establish a tone? What evidence can you provide to be able to show how that tone is developed, or in social studies or in science? And we're looking, again, students have to be able to go back and be able to verify, have to be able to make judgments and evaluations. It is a much more critical thinking approach that Common Core requires. And part of the notion behind that is our students were not critical thinkers. And so when they would enter the workplace and when they're entering the global marketplace, we would say our students had attained certain levels of education, but in comparison with their peers internationally, our students were lagging far behind, not just in their performance, but in their test scores. And so what other countries had already been doing, Common Core the attempt is to begin that process with our students. The challenge that many parents are probably having is that their students did not start their education with Common Core. They started with other state standards that were not as rigorous, and the game switched on them probably 3 or 4 years ago, depending on the state that you live in. Students had gaps between what they were expected to know at Common Core and what they had not learned yet in the standards before that. Concepts like algebra. I know you have your daughter's around my son's age. One of your daughters around my son's age. In third grade, there are concepts that my son was doing in kindergarten. There was algebra in kindergarten and geometry and things like that would never have been the elementary level, but they filter those processes down at an earlier age to prepare students so that when they get to middle school, they don't have deficits like some students who are currently in middle and high school who did not get that early foundation. Right. And so what you will probably find is that our students who are in the low elementary level will be much more successful in Common Core because that's all they know academically. But for those who were well into middle or even the high school, that's really where you see where the data is worst in terms of the achievement data on some of these state tests, because those students have such a deficit they have to close since the implementation of Common Core in their state, or in more rigorous state standards for those who did not adopt Common Core. They have some challenges as well.
You're on the ticket with Advent Sports Network, home of Falcon Pride, One-on-One with MJ, and the Lance J Radio Show. Rubicon is an ASN Talk Radio expansion franchise about current events, news, and geopolitics. All footage is taped in Dayton, Ohio, and produced at Advent Sports Network's downtown studios in the lovely Emerald City of Seattle, Washington.
Again, you're listening to Dr. Joel Boyce, Assistant Principal of Instruction at Columbia Middle School in DeKalb County. This is the Rubicon with Jeremy Winston. One final question I want to ask before we go. There's also another socioeconomic implication in Common Core. As in everything, when you make changes, it affects certain communities more negatively than others. Is your experience that there are certain communities that are more negatively impacted because of this Common Core?
Absolutely. I mean, just to characterize where I work, I work in an urban environment where my school is 99% African American, and the overwhelming majority of our students are on free and reduced lunch. Parental participation is not yet where it needs to be, and so we have some challenges that are already inherent just because of the community that we serve. We see in the data that's come back, even in Georgia on its state test and other states, that urban environments where oftentimes the parents may not be as educated as more affluent parents in some of the suburbs do not have the resources or do not know how to access the resources to prepare their children to be successful in these kinds of tests. Things like making sure their children are reading every day. For many educated parents, that's something that's just a given that we do. But if that is not something, if you're not living in a literate household where that is something that is practiced, those students already have significant deficits. If you live in a home where in urban or in very rural environments where people are not spending time with children at the dinner table or at the table working through their problems, helping them think through those critical math or science concepts, those students are unable in many cases to close their achievement gaps. And so we do see that some of the most disenfranchised young people are not just African American and Hispanic students in the inner cities, but also individuals who may be Caucasian or who also may be African American but who live in very rural environments who don't have access to some of the resources that are out there. But I will say that one good thing about Common Core is that there are a lot of online resources that have been provided much more because it's a national initiative in 42 of the states, that there are resources available to parents that were not available when each state did its own thing. It's just getting the information to parents to know what they can do and how they can help their child. That's been the message that's been kind of lost in this whole process of rolling out Common Core.
So for the parent who has a child who may be preparing to go into kindergarten or first grade, and this whole Common Core is foreign to them, and they don't know what's up or what's down, what advice can you give them to help prepare their child so that they can have success in Common Core?
I'll give you three really quick things. One, there's a lot of resources from like the National Parent Teachers Association that they actually give parents that's in parent-friendly language to help them know how to be able to prepare their child at each level for some of the rigorous kinds of questions that they will see on Common Core. Another thing that's kind of more foundational is that our students, part of Common Core is they get a Lexile score, and that is just showing how well they can be able to access and understand what they read. Don't think just language arts when we say a Lexile score and being able to read, because if you don't read with comprehension, it will affect how well you can be able to read text in social studies, in science, because all that requires certain literary competencies in order to understand what you read. Understanding that Common Core is saying that students have to read at a certain level to show mastery. Parents can work with their children on a regular basis, reading to them, or students or children reading back to them, not just fiction, but Common Core is a big focus on nonfiction text. And you probably, if you're a parent, you probably hear a lot about nonfiction text. They want to see students read a balanced diet of nonfiction and fiction text, because if they can understand nonfiction, they can understand passages on a science test. They can understand passages on a social studies test. And finally, one of the things that's probably been a big surprise for parents is how much emphasis is placed on being able to communicate in writing. And that's very, very important on any state test, no matter if they use Smarter Balance, if they use the Park Assessment or write their own. Students have to be able to write and explain their thinking critically, not just orally, but in writing. And that's something that parents need to work with their children on. There's a whole bank of released questions. They can see the different kinds of things they're going to ask them and be able to work with their children to be able to start answering those kinds of questions in writing, providing that textual evidence, which is required in all those content areas. It happens to our parents in Georgia, but actually on the math test this year, they actually have constructed responses on the math test for our students. It wasn't just language arts, but they actually have to write in math, which is a big shift for them, but it's also a very big emphasis for Common Core, because if you can write it and explain it, you probably have a much greater depth of understanding the content that you're studying.
Well, listen, Dr. Boyce, I really want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us about this. I mean, this is a very Common Core is here, as you said, and I think I misspoke earlier that it is not accepted in all 50 states. So 42 of the 50 states it is accepted in, but one way or another, I think we're definitely headed in a direction with much more. I guess I would say involved and definitely a different approach to education for our children, different from what we grew up in. And so as parents, we need to be aware of these issues. We need to make sure that we're engaged with our children, knowing what they're studying so we can support them. And then at the same time, you need to understand politically how this plays out to determine who you're going to support and politically, and if this is something you want to see in your school district, then you need to make sure you have the people in place that's going to make that happen. If this is something that you don't want to see, then you need to vote likewise to support that. So thank you for this information, Dr. Boyce. I don't think anybody could have given it as eloquently as you have, and I hope that this is somewhat beneficial to all the parents out there who are maybe struggling or just very interested in knowing how they can better prepare their students with Common Core. So thanks for being here, Dr. Boyce.
Absolutely.
All right. Take care.
Advent Sports Network is a 503c charity. All advertising proceeds from the Lance J Radio Show are used to fund nationwide youth sports programs and the Advent Sports Network Mentorship and Development Institute, which provides opportunities for young aspiring Christian journalists to cover athletic events and produce sports-related programming.